I'm Doug Keck, and welcome to the Catholic Sphere. Each week we tackle topics important to Catholics around the globe with a different host and a different focus. This week, our subject is theology, the topic tolerating the intolerable. What are Catholics to do? And to help us with that question, we welcome our distinguished panel of experts. As always, we have with us EWTN radio and television host and author, Father Brian Mullady, joins us from Portland, Oregon. We also have EWTN's Vice President of Theology, Colin Donovan, here with us in Irondale, Alabama. Also joining us is the host of Father Spitzer's Universe, a prolific author, Father Robert Spitzer, good friend of the network. He joins us from our studios in Orange County, California. Welcome, gentlemen. Great to have you all here on the Catholic Sphere. Well, let's start off, Colin, with the idea of tolerance. You know, the other day, Father Spitzer was going through the cardinal virtues, and I thought he missed one because he didn't have tolerance as number one. Am I missing something in the church there with tolerance? Where does it fit into the Christian realm?
Well, I mean, if you start with God's tolerance for us, then we have to say it has to be in some way very, very important that we be tolerant with others. You know, not to, judge the beam in their eye or the splinter in their eye and forsake the beam in our own. But I think that requires a lot of context and understanding in terms of what, what is being said there. Obviously, evil is something that's not tolerated. God, whose nature is to be, he's all good, but he's also all just, he's all merciful, all truth. In all of the superlatives to, infinite extension, if you will. And his tolerance for evil is zero. So we ought to be, intolerant of the evils in the world and in ourselves. But yet we also realize, because of our own temporality and mortality, that sometimes to change the intolerable and get rid of it, if it doesn't need outright punishing, takes some time. And I think that's where toleration does come in. It's in that respect, an element of mercy, that we recognize that, to change the intolerable situation or the person whose behavior is intolerable, sometimes punishment is the only way they can do it, but at other times, mercy and patience is called for.
Now, Father Spitzer, a number of years ago, Archbishop Chaput, when he was still in charge of Philadelphia, said, we need to remember that tolerance is not a Christian virtue, that charity, justice, mercy, prudence, honesty, these are Christian virtues. And obviously, in a diverse community, tolerance is an important working principle, but it's never an end in itself. In fact, tolerating grave evil within a society is a form of serious evil, as Colin was alluding.
Yeah, absolutely the case. And most of the virtues do really have a capacity to lead toward love. Prudence is always needed for moving toward love. Justice is needed to move toward love. Temperance is needed to move toward love. And so also with fortitude and courage, these things are all very, very good for moving toward the ideal of love, caritas, that Jesus talked about, and away from evil, away from those deadly sins that I've spoken about on programs. The key idea, though, is tolerance doesn't have anything in it that moves it toward a proper end like justice, faith, love, goodness. Tolerance is just simply, taking away the possibility or removing oneself from the possibility of judging. All right. So I'm going to tolerate right here what you are saying or what you are doing. Now that could be, as Colin just said, for a very good reason. It could be for the purpose of caritas or for the purpose of achieving the longer term good or something of that nature. But if toleration does not lead to some kind of good in the long term, if it doesn't lead to some kind of caritas, which is reaching out to do some kind of good in the long term, or if toleration is actually allowing evil to prosper, either in the short run or the long run, then toleration is not a good. It cannot be an end in itself and for itself. So toleration has that problem of it's not a self-guided missile, as it were. It can literally guide the world right into evil. It can literally guide the world into upsetting the good that was previously done. You can imagine what would have happened if Hitler's Europe had been tolerated any longer than it had been. Peace in our time. You can imagine what things would be like if we, as Edmund Burke said, all that's required for the victory of evil is for a few good people to remain silent, too tolerant.
Absolutely.
So, there we go.
So let me move on to Father Mullady. Bishop Sheen had a famous quote. He said, America, it is said, is suffering from intolerance. It is not. It is suffering from tolerance. Tolerance of right and wrong, truth and error, virtue and evil, Christ and chaos. Our country is not nearly so overrun with the bigoted as it is overrun with the broad-minded. What's your thoughts on that statement?
Well, like a good Dominican, I wish to make a distinction with the use of tolerance. The tolerance Bishop Sheen is speaking of is a tolerance which is basically born in the Masonic order. And it had to do with indifference to right and wrong, and all those other goods too. If that's what you mean by tolerance, then it's absolutely correct that it can't be practiced. But if by tolerance you meant what the church means, Pius XII actually wrote as one of his works the fact that toleration of evil is one of the principles of the social order. And he said error in itself has no right to exist. However, if in quashing certain errors you destroy greater goods or lead to worse errors, and this of course comes in the famous parable of the wheat and the tares, it's true that evil will be punished in the end when the harvest is made, where the wheat and the chaff are separated from each other. But while we live in this world, there are some things that society has to tolerate, lest in seeking to root them out, it leads to greater disorder or difficulty or evil. And St. Augustine actually had a principle about that when it had to do with, and this is a very difficult quotation, obviously, but it's also used by St. Thomas in the Summa, that if you take the ladies of ill repute out of society, totally, you seek to forbid it completely, as the Puritans did, that you unbridle all to licentiousness. And so it's important not to be too severe with people. Ideas are different.
Right, exactly.
When it comes to ideas, we do have we shouldn't tolerate wrong ideas. But when it comes to people, we sometimes have to tolerate the wickedness that they do, lest in trying to uproot the wicked, we also destroy the good, because we don't really know what else in some cases.
Well, that's an important distinction, and it's made by many people over the idea that you have to separate in dealing with people versus particular ideas. Also, Bishop Sheen said, Colin, broad-mindedness, when it means the indifference, that's how he defines it, to right and wrong, eventually ends up, he said, in the hatred of what is right. Is that something we see today?
Oh, absolutely. I think we've come almost to the end game of that idea, because now it's quite acceptable to be both intolerant of those who oppose you in political ideas, but also even to hate them and to treat them as if you hate them. And you see all the things that follow from hatred and contempt for individuals in the reaction, say, to example, to the prospect of the abortion becoming illegal according to the states. If that were to occur or has already occurred, then people are just incensed about it. And they can't make the distinctions that the church made, which Father Mullady made so well from Thomas and Augustine, but rather they see only what the other aspect of evil is, and that is that you want to root it out and destroy it. But without the proper understanding of what is truly good and evil, with this indifference of mind or this liberality of mind, that means you have no idea what you are destroying, and greater evils then can come from destroying it. Sort of the opposite side of the coin of when the church saying that toleration of some evils may be required in order to avoid greater evils, but in this viewpoint instead, there is no toleration of what is conceived in their minds as an evil, but rather they pursue it till it's exterminated. And of course, that has led to extermination camps and concentration camps and gulags and so on. And that's going to be the inevitable result of this thinking unless it's reversed.
Well, let me ask you, Father Spitzer. There was an article not that long ago talked about a couple of justices' approaches, both quote-unquote Catholics, and they indicated both are in basic agreement that abortion is wrong, homosexual acts are immoral, marriage is between a man and a woman. What they differ on is to what extent a court or government can impose the beliefs of one sector of the electorate on all the citizens of a free country. So we get into that idea. Is the church imposing its morality on the secular culture?
Well, of course, the church is not imposing anything on the secular culture. It couldn't if it wanted to. So the first thing is the church is attempting to educate about good and evil so that when we are thinking about tolerance or thinking about political impositions, when we're thinking about education of conscience and education of the populace so that justice might really be carried out, then of course the church has a right role in talking about what is good and evil. Tolerance itself, imposition itself, political imposition itself, these are morally neutral. They can be used for good or for evil, to tolerate good or to tolerate evil, et cetera, et cetera. So the problem with toleration in itself, the problem with avoiding, as it were, the imposition of one's conscience or the imposition of religion is that, of course, it goes nowhere. It has no guiding light. So the church has the responsibility of pointing out what that is, of educating people as to what the good is. Sometimes the good is very evident, right? And sometimes evil is very evident. In my view, abortion is an evil that is very evident. Now that we've all admitted that the beginning of a new, unique human life begins at fertilization and conception, then I think to kill this life, this innocent life, unnecessarily, is clearly an evil. Now, anybody who says we've got to tolerate this clear evil in order to accommodate other people's consciences, we're not accommodating their consciences. We are accommodating their lack of conscience, their lack of formation of conscience. We can't afford to do that as a culture, lest we become, brutish, ugly, and short, right, in our livelihood. So the first thing is the church has a responsibility to do this, especially in those cases where the evil is still sort of hidden. As I said, abortion, I mean, science has already opened the box. It's very clear that it is evil. Someone might say, well, homosexual acts are not evil. This is just a plain and good thing. But then when you start looking at it from another point of view, you automatically see, well, wait a minute, what about its effects on emotional health? Oh, you have a 3 times increase in depression, a 3 times increase in anxiety, a 5 times increase in panic disorders, a 7 times increase in suicidal contemplation. So 40% of that population is thinking of committing suicide most of the time. Wait a minute, there's something here. Now, psychology is starting to shine a light. These are all surveys done by the Archives of General Psychiatry. They're shining a light on what the church has been saying, interpreting the words of Jesus Christ for centuries. There's something wrong with this view. There's something wrong with sexuality being an end in itself, having no purpose beyond itself for family or for children children or for the good of society, but that is just, you know, something to be toyed with, contrary, obviously, to the will of the Creator.
Right,
so I think the church has that responsibility.
Right, exactly, and your past, obviously, very involved in the pro-life movement. Father Mullady, one of the things that's interesting to kind of play off that, and of course the abortion issue, was that recently the Planned Parenthood affiliates have started to come out and say that the phrase pro-choice is out. We don't use that anymore. We're pro-abortion. What does that tell us?
Well, it tells us, first of all, they're being honest. Margaret Sanger left the movement when they changed to Planned Parenthood, because she says it's not Planned Parenthood, it's abortion. Let's face it, because she felt they were being dishonest. The issue really turns not around the church imposing its morality. It turns around the church attempting to point out, as all good reasonable people do, what the nature of the natural law is. Because if we left it on the plane of religion, of course, we don't have an established religion in this country. But it's the matter of the natural law, then of course that is something quite different. And what we're trying to show is that the attempt to do away with marriage is not only unreasonable, but it completely, in reason, uncuts all the things that marriage exists for, which of course is reaffirmed and made stronger by Christ. But the natural law is very clear on the difficulties that are involved in this. Some people may not be intelligent enough to discover it, and some cultures may not be able to understand it, but it can certainly be explained on the level of reason. And what we're trying to do is to get people to think logically and reasonably, which of course you know today is considered to be some kind of racial thing. To think there's an objective truth that transcends all of the truths that people can discover by reason. I recently read a Lutheran historian who is very pro-Catholic, and he said that the reason that science, objective science, flourished in Europe and America and not in other cultures was because Judeo-Christian religion is the only religion that believes in an ordering mind behind creation. And so the ordering mind in man's case is something that even the Greeks thought, and the Romans, however mistaken they may have been sometimes in what they discovered, but they thought that you could discover this by examining what Socrates says, the unexamined life. So it's something that's accessible to reason alone, even though because of our darkness sometimes intellectually, we need faith to help us with this.
So, Colin, somebody recently said, even today, indiscriminate tolerance would not be allowed. The public, obviously, an official would not tolerate child abuse or tax evasion. That person would be considered virtuous. And there's a line from St. John, George Bernard Shaw wrote, "We may talk of toleration all we will, but society must always draw a line somewhere between allowable contact and insanity or crime."
Yeah, and I think it illustrates what we've been talking about so far in the program, this sort of devolution of the mind, of the logic. You know, in other contexts, if you look at gender ideology, you know, you find that when you can, by a natural understanding, reason applied to the nature of man, the purposes of the sexual faculties, therefore the value of marriage, even lifelong marriage, all of these are essentially natural realities. But once you devolve that to the subjective viewpoint, what you end up is not 3 genders, not 10 genders, but I think the number is up to 625 or so. And there is no practical limit with such thinking to there being 7 billion genders on the planet. Everybody seeing their sexuality and gender is unique to them alone. It gives them a particular value and a way of expressing themselves uniquely from every other human being. So why not? And all of that is due to the abandonment of any kind of objective reality. And all that is, as Father Mullady pointed out, is the natural law. Man's reason as it's able to understand nature, its purposes, and so on. And when that's lost, we're thrown on ourselves. And I remember something that I read in the writings of John Paul II. I think it was when he was still philosophizing in Poland in one of his Polish writings. I found it in Italian when I was studying in Rome. And he talked about the way that once you've abandoned an objective understanding of man, what we would call philosophical anthropology, Thomistic anthropology to be specific, once you abandon that, what the reasons will follow emotions completely, and he called it a spiraling out of control into emotionalism and all these kinds of particularisms. And so we're seeing the exact coming about of that which he predicted would happen from the loss of an objective understanding of man, his nature, and the realities connected to him.
Right. Now, Father Spitzer, is it a misapprehension to notice that the people who claim toleration and tolerance to be such a virtue seem to be the most intolerant?
It's not a mistaken impression. I read about it every day in the news. I read about it in academic journals. I mean, it's I'm not reading about it. I'm seeing it actually applied, where you have two standards. There's one for the group who's right, quote unquote, and one for the group who's wrong. And you have now you must be tolerant of the group that is right, and you must be intolerant of the group that's wrong. And of course, as all of our panelists have been saying today, it's devolved into complete subjectivism on the part of not only the truth, but also the good. So we can't even get agreement that genocide is wrong. We can't get agreement that the killing of an innocent is wrong. And so we're pretty much at the point where we have subjectivized ourselves, not only out of the natural law, though certainly that, but outside of our conscience and outside of any tradition about what was right and wrong. So we're beyond the realms of reason, conscience, tradition, and even faith. We've basically subjectivized ourselves into believing there really is no such thing as right and wrong, which is what Pope Benedict called the tyranny of relativism. And the tyranny of relativism has grown considerably since his time. So what can we do about it? We have to stop tolerating the intolerable.
Right.
When we see just hypocrisy on a grand scale, you know, at least we could say, hey, if you're demanding tolerance, then you better be tolerant yourself. How is it that you can, you know, pluck out the little splinter of intolerance in your neighbor's eye, so that you, but while ignoring the beam of intoleration in your eye? And I do think we need to start challenging the culture as good Catholics, whether we're lay people, clerics, whatever we may be. We need to start challenging the culture more vociferously. We should call out hypocrisy, especially on this whole term of toleration. And I think when we see rights that are asserted as wrong and wrongs that are asserted as right, I think we should speak out immediately and tell them, I don't think it's reasonable. Here's what scientific opinions are. Appeal, of course, to the natural law. Appeal to conscience. Appeal, if you must, to personal testimony. Appeal even to, you know, people you admire as moral examples. Right. Mother Teresa. But make an appeal. Do not remain silent. Absolutely. And tolerate the intolerable.
Now, Father Mullady, an article I read recently mentioned that Voltaire took Thomas Aquinas to task for having dared to say that he wished all the world was Christian, accusing him of being intolerant. Their point was, but for Aquinas, that was the same as saying he wished that all men be happy.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, yeah, well, poor old Voltaire. As I recall, I could be corrected by this by somebody else, but he died with a priest at the end.
Absolutely.
Because after he
convinced he was going to go to heaven, too.
Absolutely. And, as you know, all this toleration of the French Revolution led to everybody being guillotined. People that didn't tolerate that they were guillotined, they guillotined the others. And there was nothing left. And I have to tell you that I don't understand this age we live in. I was watching TV the other day, and this doctor says, well, you know, when the baby comes out of the womb, the doctor has to decide whether he's male or female. And I said, really? Isn't it obvious? I mean, what does he have to use to decide whether he's male or female anyway? You know, I don't understand all this stuff. And, you know, as the doctor was saying too, you know, you subjectively determine your sex, all right? But I can determine I'm the opposite sex tomorrow. And then I can determine I'm another sex the next day and another sex the next day.
Right.
And what's to keep us from determining our race? They won't let us do that. So why can't I identify as, you know, Mexican today or something like that? They won't let us do that. And also, this toleration business, I mean, we're all prosecuted, we're all scared, and we should be, for the pedophilic clergy. And yet I was reading an article the other day that said, oh, well, that's the last frontier. It really isn't child abuse anymore. You know, so we're tolerating that now, apparently, too. So I have no idea. Also, I believe the toleration comes, oddly enough, I'll say this just quickly up front, from contraception. Because once you take away any objective standards for love in the family relationship, you rob people of their, what Father Spitzer was talking about fortitude. And in robbing them of their fortitude, you make them easily victims of evil. And certainly in the Western world, beginning at least with the World War I, people were easily victims of evil. And they just didn't have the ability to resist until it became something that required a terrible vengeance on the human race, which could happen.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there, and I hope Colin will tolerate that I never got to him to close out the program. But we'd like to thank Father Brian Mullady once more from Portland, Oregon, of course. And we've got our own Colin Donovan here in Irondale, Alabama, my pal Father Robert Spitzer, whose birthday happened a few months ago, in Orange County, California. And we thank you for joining us again today. Don't forget to join us next week when your host will be our great pal, Father Joseph Mary Wolf, here on the Catholic Sphere. And look for us coming soon in the future with more theological episodes.